Welcome to Friendship Friday. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. My apologies that there again wasn't a walk this last Wednesday, and sadly there won't be one next Wednesday either, as I will be attending the Provincial Standing Committee, and though it's taking place on a virtual platform, I will sadly not be available to do any walking. So I will return again next Friday. Today, I would like to pick up a little from where I left off last week and the week before. 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the importance of being friends with life, and last week touched on the importance of opportunity and potential and embracing what life does offer despite limitations. And today, of course, we look forward to a shift to level 1 in our alert level structures here in South Africa. And that will open up things a little bit more, not fully, but it will give us a little bit more breathing space. Having said all of that, I'm very aware that during this lockdown period, the stresses and strains, the changes that it's demanded, the letting go of what we considered normal, and embracing of the new context that the pandemic and the virus has thrust upon us, has really shifted our foundations on some quite deep levels. And of course, when these shifts happen, cracks show up. And those cracks have showed up globally. They've showed up nationally, and particularly in just highlighting quite deep levels of ongoing corruption in our nation. It's also highlighted, and again more globally as well as nationally, issues around racism, the sort of levels of discrimination that are so inherent to our social structures. But it's done more than that. It's uncovered fault lines in our more intimate and personal spaces as well. Some of that would be within more close, intimate, personal relationships. Some of it, perhaps relationships with others in the communities that we serve. And having our eyes open can be very discomforting. And as we've traveled this journey, there's been a lot that's left us, I suspect, certainly left me feeling a little rattled along the way. Not only having to cope with a new way of living, but actually having to take account of the brokenness of my own life, my own way of relating, the brokenness of my community and the relationships that exist in that space, and then being probably quite overwhelmed by the fact that that's visible on a national and international level. Now, one can roll over and give up, but one can also move forward, and that was part of what I was encouraging last week, that we really do look for the potentials and the opportunities and embrace those. And importantly, when we note the fault lines that show up, not necessarily to take those personally. And I'm not saying there that if we need to acknowledge accountability that we don't do that. But to recognize that these things are, while they impact on who we are, and we may even be part of ensuring that those things continue, perhaps unconsciously a lot of the time, they don't break down the essential nature of who God has created us to be. And I always go back to Genesis 1, where very encouragingly, God says on the day that he creates human beings, he says, not only is this good, he says it's very good. And we need to embrace that and know that that somehow just holds our lives, the goodness of God that is created in us. We do miss the boat a lot of the times. We do create unnecessary hurt in each other's lives. We do respond negatively or wrongly or unethically, often without any real intention of doing so, but just that because the nature of who we are as human beings, the nature of the society and social structures we've built around us, makes us complicit in so much of that brokenness. And so this morning, I wanted to come back to a versicle from the morning prayer I've been using from Padraig Ó Tuama's daily prayer with the Corrymeela community. And it's the same versicle that I referred to last week, because it holds both that sense of possibility and opportunity, but it also acknowledges our fragility and our brokenness. And so if I could just read you that versicle again, and a prayer obviously to God. Help us to embrace possibility, respond graciously to disappointment, and hold tenderly those we encounter. Help us be fully present to the day. Now, I think part of what I was touching on just now was that when we recognize the fault lines in our own lives and our sort of social, political, and economic context, the response is disappointment. And the prayer is that we would respond graciously to that disappointment. And particularly respond graciously to that disappointment when it involves somebody we know and love and or live with or work with. And what I love about this morning prayer is that there's a simplicity to it, and there's a beauty in this reminder. Help us, Lord, to respond graciously to disappointment. When I look back over the day and the evening, I recognize I haven't got that right a lot of the time. But I also recognize that in recognizing that, I'm able to revisit it. And my second response often is, in fact, to be gracious in accepting that disappointment and embracing those that have caused me that disappointment. And sometimes it's me that's caused me that disappointment. So it's an ability to be gracious with others, but also to be gracious with ourselves. And then it goes on to say to hold tenderly those we encounter. And I think that for me is the most difficult part of relationship. I personally often enter into a conversation. I have an agenda in mind. I want to get to a certain point. And I can lack tenderness in the way that I try to get to that point. And often it's just to remind myself to stop and say hello to the person I'm talking to ask that question, how are you? And of course, we all know that that's quite a dangerous question because sometimes people actually tell us. And there's a graciousness in receiving what people share in that moment. And in fact, when people do take our question at face value and share how they're feeling, it gives us an insight into the context of their lives. And it enables us to be more tender in our reactions thereafter. And I think so important. A lot of the hurts I'm dealing with in a number of contexts where I have some responsibility, it's because people, and sometimes myself included, we just have not been tender with each other. And we have allowed truth to be harsh and, in fact, to be hurtful. So I'm not suggesting here that we shouldn't be direct, we shouldn't be transparent, we shouldn't hold to the truth. But there's a real need to be tender with each other. And particularly at this point, as we are 5 months, 6 months into this pandemic and its impact on our society, many of us are just struggling on all sorts of levels, many of which we're just not conscious of. But so much of our life has changed around us, so much transition is being demanded of us, that we may not always have the resources, the emotional resources, particularly, to cope with that. And sometimes even the mental resources. And sometimes even our spirituality is faltering. And to recognize that, for me to recognize that in myself is important. But it's also important to recognize that that's happening for you. And if we can both then hold the disappointments we may create for one another, and if we may hold each other tenderly, then the encounters we have will become, instead of breaking encounters, they have the potential and the possibility to be creative encounters. And that is my prayer, that as we move forward into level 1, as we begin to embrace those who have, due to being frontline workers or whatever, have been involved in living the physical life to the full for some time, and many others who've actually we've been locked away in our homes and we haven't been out there. That's just one very clear difference from how we've been living. So to be tender with those who are somewhat anxious about re-engaging in physical interaction, and to be understanding of those who have been out there all the time, and for them there's very little anxiety or fear there. But to trust in all of this, that despite the fractures in our world, despite the brokenness of our humanity, despite the disappointments that we are learning to live with and carry, that God, despite all of that, is present. And that is the hope that we carry as people of faith. That God is there to walk beside us when we feel totally resourceless, to know that we have the resources of heaven to call upon. And that is the gift of the Holy Spirit in our lives. God is there to resource us. The Anglican baptismal creed speaks about the Spirit being the source of life. And what encourages me is not only does God resource us with that source of life, but God also seeks to sustain that within us. And so to trust that there is something far broader, far bigger than ourselves, that holds us, that carries us, that nurtures us, that sustains us. And this prayer that I've shared with you this versicle from morning prayer, is one that just reminds us that God is there, and that we need to share something of the nature of God as we encounter one another in these days.